Hey, before we dive in, I need to be upfront with you. This voice you're hearing, it's AI-generated narration, but the script, the research, every single line you're about to hear, that's me. I wrote it, I investigated it, I pieced it all together. The technology is just lending the voice. The laser pierced through the forest canopy. Heiko Prümers was staring at his computer screen. It was 2019, Bolivia, Llanos de Mojos region. And this LiDAR technology was revealing something nobody expected to see. Straight lines, perfect circles, giant squares, all hidden beneath miles and miles of dense jungle. And then he realized, this wasn't natural. This had been built. Entire cities, planned, with streets, plazas, irrigation canals, all covered by trees for centuries. And you know what's most disturbing? We always thought the Amazon was untouched, virgin, a forest where nobody had ever really lived. But look, we were wrong the whole time. Completely wrong, because what Prümers found wasn't an isolated village, wasn't a temporary camp. It was a complex urban network covering more than 4,000 square kilometers. 4,000. To give you an idea, that's larger than the entire city of São Paulo, and there's more. These cities were between 1,000 and 2,500 years old. That means while Rome was dominating Europe, people in the Amazon were building advanced metropolises, and we didn't know, or rather, we forgot. I confess that when I first read about this, I was shocked. Like, what do you mean the Amazon had cities? How come nobody ever saw this before? And you, had you heard about this? Leave it in the comments. I'm curious to know if this story is new to you too. But going back, LiDAR doesn't lie. It's a technology that uses laser pulses to map the ground beneath vegetation, works like an X-ray of the forest, and what it showed was absurdly clear. Monumental structures, elevated platforms up to 20 meters high, pyramids, giant water reservoirs connected by canals, pyramids in the Amazon. Wait, let that sink in for a second. We grew up hearing that pyramids were an Egypt thing, a Mexico thing, maybe Peru. But Amazon? Nobody talked about that. No history book mentioned it. And now we discover they existed. And there weren't just a few, there were dozens, spread across an immense area. Heiko Prümers published the study in 2022 in the journal Nature. He called these cities Caçarabe culture. And look, I read the article, read the maps, saw the digital reconstructions, and man, it's spine-chilling, because it's not speculation, it's not some crazy theory, it's solid scientific evidence, satellite, or photographs, field data, archaeological excavations. And you know what bothers me most? These cities were abandoned long before Europeans arrived. Long before. When the Spanish entered the Amazon in the 16th century, they found forest, saw some small tribes living by the rivers, and concluded that nothing had ever existed there beyond that the forest was too hostile, too infertile, impossible to sustain large populations. But they were wrong, totally wrong, because centuries earlier, that same place had sustained tens of thousands of people, maybe hundreds of thousands, living in organized cities with advanced agriculture, with sophisticated hydraulic systems. And then you stop to think, what happened? Where did all these people go? Why did they abandon everything? And especially, what else don't we know about the Amazon? Because look, these discoveries in Llanos de Mojos aren't isolated, aren't unique. In the last 20 years, archaeologists have been finding evidence of complex civilizations at various points in the Amazon. In the Upper Xingu, in Brazil, in Acre, in Ecuador, in the Tapajos River Basin. Always the same thing. LiDAR reveals structures, excavations confirm, and the history we knew needs to be rewritten. There's a researcher named Michael Heckenberger who worked in the Xingu for years. He found traces of planned cities with wide avenues connecting villages, circular central plazas surrounded by defensive structures, road systems that extended for kilometers, all dated between 800 and 1400 AD, and there's more. Recently, In 2024, a team led by Stephen Rostain found in the Ecuadorian Amazon an urban network with more than 6,000 structures. 6,000. Residential mounds, ceremonial platforms, elevated agricultural fields, all interconnected by roads and canals, and all more than 2,000 years old. 2,000 years. That's before Christ was born. Let me repeat that because this is important. While the Romans were building the Colosseum, people in the Amazon were building complex cities with advanced hydraulic engineering. And we didn't know. We simply didn't know. And have you ever stopped to ask yourself why? Why didn't we know? Why didn't anyone teach this in school? Tell me in the comments what your theory is. Ignorance, prejudice, or maybe the forest hid everything so well that it was impossible to discover before modern technology. I personally think it's a mixture of everything. The forest really hides things well. When you're in there on the ground, looking up at the intertwined branches blocking the sun, you don't see anything. Don't see patterns. Don't see straight lines, just see green, infinite green. But from space you see everything. And LiDAR goes even deeper, penetrates the vegetation, ignores the trees, and reveals what's underneath, what's always been underneath. Ghost cities, silent, waiting. And now that we know they exist, another question arises, an even more disturbing question. If the Amazon had cities 2,500 years ago, how did they survive? Because the Amazon rainforest isn't exactly an easy place to live. The soil is poor, acidic, infertile for the most part. It rains too much in certain seasons and dries out too much in others. There are diseases, insects, predators. How do you sustain thousands of people in this environment? How do you plant enough food? How do you build permanent cities when the ground beneath your feet is practically sand? And that's when the story gets even stranger, because they didn't just manage, they transformed the soil. Literally, they created a type of artificial fertile soil called Terra Preta. And this soil still exists, still there, after more than 2,000 years. But that's a subject for what comes next, because if you're finding this disturbing so far, just wait until you discover what they did with the soil, and how it challenges everything we thought we knew about agriculture, ecology, and ancient engineering. Which detail so far intrigued you most? The pyramids, the planned cities, or the fact that all of this was hidden for so long? Tell me down below. I want to know what you're thinking. So how do you feed an entire city in a forest where the soil looks like sand? Simple. You create your own soil. Terra Preta de Indio, black earth of the Indians, Amazonian dark earth. It has several names, but the concept is the same. It's a type of extremely fertile soil, dark, rich in nutrients, that appears in hundreds of locations scattered throughout the Amazon. And here's the bizarre detail. It's not natural. It was made, manufactured, by humans more than 2,000 years ago, and it still works, even today. You take a handful of common Amazonian soil, reddish, poor in organic matter, acidic. You plant something there and nothing grows. Right, needs heavy fertilizer, needs constant management. It's agricultural hell. Now you take a handful of Terra Preta, really black, dark as charcoal. You plant the same seed, and it explodes, grows strong, vigorous, without needing almost anything extra. And this after millennia buried beneath the forest. How? How is this possible? The answer is in the composition. Terra Preta isn't just dirt, it's an intentional mixture of charcoal, broken pottery fragments, animal bones, ash, food scraps, human feces, all decomposed and mixed over generations. The charcoal especially, biochar, as scientists call it today, it acts like a sponge, retains water, retains nutrients, creates a perfect environment for microorganisms that make the soil even more fertile. And look, this wasn't an accident, wasn't luck. It was engineering, soil engineering, deliberate, sophisticated. Wim Sombrook was one of the first modern scientists to study this seriously in the 80s. He mapped hundreds of Terra Preta sites scattered throughout the Amazon basin. Some small, others gigantic, covering hectares and hectares, and all had the same characteristic: depth. It wasn't a thin layer on the surface, it was a meter and a half of enriched soil. This doesn't happen overnight. This takes centuries, generations working in the same place. And you know what that means? It means permanence. It means these populations weren't nomadic, weren't small groups that planted a little and moved on. They were established societies, fixed, with accumulated knowledge passed from generation to generation. Can you imagine the level of social organization necessary for this, to coordinate the creation of fertile soil on an urban scale, to decide where to plant, what to plant, how to distribute food to thousands of people? It's not trivial, it's not simple, it's complex, very complex. And this brings me back to the cities Heiko Prümers found, because now it makes sense. You don't build 20-meter-high pyramids without having enough food. You don't maintain a dense population without stable agriculture. And you don't have stable agriculture in the Amazon unless you manufacture your own soil. They did this, and they did it on an absurd scale. But there's another layer to this story, because Terra Preta doesn't appear alone. It shows up alongside other massive landscape modifications, geoglyphs. Ever heard of them? In Acre, in Brazil, archaeologists discovered hundreds of giant geometric structures, circles, squares, hexagons, some more than 300 meters in diameter, built by digging ditches up to 4 meters deep and piling the earth into embankments around them. All perfectly symmetrical, all aligned, and there weren't just a few, there were hundreds, maybe thousands still hidden beneath the forest. Denise Schan was one of the main researchers of these geoglyphs before she passed away in 2018. She spent years mapping these structures, and her conclusion was clear. That wasn't decorative, wasn't art, it was functional, probably ceremonial too, but definitely functional. Meeting places, ritual centers, territorial markers, and the dating. Some are more than 2,000 years old. 2,000 years. Again, you're starting to see the pattern. Pyramids in Bolivia, geoglyphs in Acre, Terra Preta everywhere, all dated to the same era, all showing the same level of organization, and all forgotten, completely forgotten. So why did we forget? How does an entire civilization disappear from collective memory? The most obvious answer is population. Collapse. And here comes the tragic part. When Europeans arrived in the Americas at the end of the 15th century, they brought diseases. Smallpox, measles, influenza, diseases the native peoples had never seen. No immunity, no defense. And they died by the millions. It's estimated that between 50 and 90% of the native population of the Americas died in the first 100 years after European contact. 50 to 90%. Let that sink in. It's apocalyptic, it's mass extinction. And in the Amazon, it was probably even worse, because diseases arrived before the Europeans themselves. They traveled through trade networks, jumped from village to village, decimated entire populations before any Spaniard or Portuguese set foot in the region. So when the explorers finally arrived, they found an empty forest, or almost empty, saw ruins covered by vegetation, saw small surviving groups living much more simply than their ancestors, and concluded it had always been like that. But no, it hadn't always been like that. And look, if you're finding this story fascinating so far, give it a like. Seriously. This helps other people discover this too, and subscribe to the channel, because there's more forgotten history out there. Because I keep thinking, how many other civilizations don't we know about? How many other lost cities are still waiting beneath the jungle? That's the question that won't leave my head, and it's the question that drives the archaeologists working in the Amazon today. Because now, with LiDAR, with modern technology, We're finally managing to see through the forest. We're managing to see what's always been there, hidden, silent, but not invisible. It was never invisible. We just didn't know where to look. And this changes everything. Changes how we see the Amazon, changes how we see the history of the Americas, even changes how we see humanity's own capacity to transform hostile environments into habitable places. Because if they managed to do this 2,000 years ago, what else is possible but going back to those cities? Because we still haven't talked about how they were organized, how they functioned, how thousands of people lived together, coordinated, work, built monuments, managed resources. And that's when things get even more impressive. The cities weren't chaotic, weren't random. They were planned, geometrically planned. When you look at the maps that LiDAR generated, man, you see patterns, concentric circles, enormous central plazas surrounded by residential mounds arranged at regular intervals, wide avenues connecting different sectors, water canals running parallel to the roads. All symmetrical, all intentional, and this isn't one isolated city doing it their own way. It's a repeated pattern, multiple cities in the same region, following the same urban design model. What does that tell you? It tells you there was communication, knowledge sharing, probably a unified culture with common architectural values. Stephen Rostain, the archaeologist who worked in Ecuador, described the cities he found as urban gardens. It wasn't just construction, it was integration. Residences surrounded by elevated agricultural fields, water reservoirs strategically positioned, orchards probably planted in specific patterns. They didn't dominate the forest, they worked with it, modified it, created a managed version of it. And here's something I find particularly fascinating. The Amazon rainforest we see today, it's not completely natural, not in the way we imagine. Recent studies show that a significant percentage of tree species in the Amazon were deliberately cultivated by humans. Brazil nut trees, cacao, acai, pupunha palm trees of various types. Charles Clement, a botanist who studies this, estimates that about 12% of adult trees in the Amazon are of species that were domesticated or semi-domesticated by pre-Columbian peoples. 12%. That's billions of trees. The forest is a garden. A gigantic garden, abandoned centuries ago, but still carrying the marks of those who cultivated it. This completely changes the narrative, doesn't it? The idea of a virgin, untouched forest. It crumbles, and in its place emerges something more complex, more interesting. A landscape co-created by humans and nature over millennia. But back to the cities themselves, because urban design is one thing, engineering is another. The hydraulic systems these civilizations built are impressive. And I'm not exaggerating, really impressive. Irrigation canals kilometers long, interconnected reservoirs that captured rainwater and distributed it during droughts, elevated platforms that protected constructions from seasonal floods. And look, the Amazon isn't an easy place for hydraulic engineering. There's dry season and rainy season. During the floods, gigantic areas are submerged. During the drought, the water level drops drastically. You need to manage both extremes, and they managed. In Llanos de Mojos, that region in Bolivia where Heiko Prümers worked, archaeologists found evidence of elevated fields called camelones. They're agricultural beds built above water level, separated by canals. During floods, the canals fill. During droughts, water from the canals irrigates the beds. And the fish that live in the canals, they fertilize the water with their waste, which in turn nourishes the plants. It's a closed system, self-sustaining, ingenious, and it works. Modern farmers in the region who tried to replicate these ancient techniques achieved harvests 3-4 times larger than using conventional methods. 3 to 4 times, with 2,000-year-old technology. Don't you find that disturbing? I do, because it means we lost knowledge. Practical, Functional knowledge that worked better than what we have today in certain contexts. And it's not just agriculture. The monumental structures themselves, the pyramids, the elevated platforms, they weren't built with stone like in Egypt or Mexico. They were built with earth, packed earth, compacted in layers, sometimes reinforced with wood or pottery. Sounds fragile, right? But it's not. These structures survived 2,000 years of tropical rain, 2,000 years of vegetation growing on top of them, and they're still there, still maintain their shape, can still be identified. Clark Erickson, an archaeologist who's been working in the Amazon for decades, argues these populations had deep knowledge of soil mechanics. They knew how to compact earth to create durable structures. They knew how to drain water to avoid erosion. They knew how to stabilize slopes. And they knew because they had to know. Because if you make mistakes in the Amazon, the forest takes back fast, very fast. So these cities represent not just ambition, they represent technical competence, accumulated knowledge, generations of trial and error until discovering what worked. And it worked for centuries, maybe millennia. But then, why did it stop? Why were these cities abandoned? There are several theories. Climate change, prolonged drought, environmental collapse caused by overexploitation of resources, wars, diseases. It was probably a combination. It always is. But there's one theory I find particularly interesting, the theory that the very success of these civilizations led to their collapse, because the more you grow, the more resources you need, more food, more water, more land to cultivate, and eventually you hit a limit. The environment can't handle anymore. And then the entire system crumbles. It's the classic pattern of civilizational collapse. We saw this in Rome. We saw this with the Maya. We saw this on Easter Island. And we probably saw this in the Amazon too. But the difference is that in the Amazon, the forest came back, covered everything, erased the evidence. And when Europeans arrived centuries later, almost nothing visible remained. Just stories. Legends, fragmentary accounts of golden cities and lost kingdoms that nobody took seriously. El Dorado, ever heard of it? The legend of the city of gold that obsessed Spanish conquistadors for decades. They searched, explored rivers, crossed jungles, died by the thousands searching, and never found it. Because there was no city of gold, but there probably were cities, real cities, populous, prosperous, that the first explorers saw or heard about. And then the story grew, gained exaggerations, until it became myth. But at the bottom of the myth, there was truth, and now we're discovering what that truth was. Can you imagine what it's like to be there, in the forest? Standing on top of a mound covered with trees, knowing that beneath your feet there's a pyramid, that around you there were streets, houses, thousands of people living their lives, and now there's only silence, only green. I confess it gives me chills. Thinking about it gives me chills, thinking about how many stories were lost, how many names, how many lives, and it gives me even more chills, thinking that maybe we haven't even found half of what's there yet, because the Amazon is immense, and LiDAR has only been used on a tiny fraction of it. What else is waiting? What other cities? What other secrets? But who were these people? Because so far we've talked about cities, about engineering, about agriculture, but we haven't talked about people, about how they lived, what they believed, how they organized themselves socially. And here's where things get complicated, because they didn't leave writing, didn't leave texts. There are no scrolls, no clay tablets, no hieroglyphs on walls. What remained was pottery, stone tools, bones, architectural remains. And from that, we have to reconstruct an entire civilization. It's like assembling a giant puzzle where 90% of the pieces disappeared, but you can infer some things. The pottery, for example. Amazonian pottery is elaborate, Very elaborate. Vases decorated with complex geometric patterns, funerary urns with sculpted human faces, bowls painted with representations of animals. Each region had its own style, its visual signature. And that tells you something. It tells you there was free time. That not everyone was occupied all the time, just trying to survive. There was specialization. There were artisans dedicated exclusively to making pottery, which means there was enough food production to sustain people who didn't produce food. That's a mark of complex society, of social stratification. And there's more evidence of this. The mounds that served as bases for constructions, they weren't all the same size. Some were enormous, others small. The large ones were probably for the elite, leaders, priests, I don't know. The small ones were for the rest of the population. Social inequality, hierarchy, like in every complex civilization we know. But unlike other civilizations, there's no strong evidence of war, not at the level we see with the Maya or the Aztecs. Sure, there must have been conflict, there always is, but it doesn't seem to have been the central focus of society. The cities weren't fortified, didn't have elaborate defensive walls. There are no artistic representations of battles or warriors. What they had was water control. And that was probably more important than military control. Because in the Amazon, whoever controls water controls everything. Controls where you can plant, controls transportation, controls fishing. And the hydraulic systems these civilizations built, they required constant maintenance, coordination, cooperation between different groups. Jonas Gregorio de Souza, a Brazilian archaeologist who studies these societies, argues that political organization probably revolved around the management of these hydraulic systems. Leaders who coordinated collective work, who ensured canals were dredged, that reservoirs were maintained, that water distribution was fair, power based on technical competence and organizational capacity. Not necessarily on violence, it's a different way of thinking about power, and perhaps more sustainable, at least for a while. But what about religion? What did they believe? Here we enter the territory of speculation, because without texts, it's impossible to know for sure. But the monumental structures, the pyramids, the elevated platforms, they probably had ceremonial function, meeting places, places of ritual, maybe places of astronomical observation too. Some of the structures found in Acre, those giant geoglyphs, are aligned with solstices, with specific positions of the sun at certain times of year. That's not an accident, it's intentional. And if you're paying attention to the sky, if you're marking the movement of stars, the sun, the moon, you probably have a cosmology, a worldview, where these cycles matter, where sky and earth are connected. It's not very different from the Maya, or the Egyptians, or any other ancient civilization that built monuments aligned with celestial events. The difference is that here everything was built with earth, with the most basic material possible, and still, it was still impressive. Still conveyed power, authority, connection with something greater. Can you imagine? A ceremony happening on top of a 20-meter pyramid. Hundreds, maybe thousands of people. Gathered in the plaza below, fires lit, drums playing, the smell of food being prepared, smoke rising in spirals to the sky. And all around, just forest as far as the eye can see. It must have been impressive. Imposing. And then all of that disappeared. The population died or migrated. The ceremonies stopped, the fires went out, and the forest returned, slowly, tree by tree, until it covered everything. And it stayed that way for centuries, 5 centuries, maybe more, until someone pointed a laser from the sky and said, "Wait, there's something here." And now we're rediscovering, bringing back to light, rewriting history. But there's a question that bothers me, a question I can't stop thinking about. If these civilizations were so advanced, if they had sophisticated agriculture, impressive engineering, complex social organization, why didn't they leave a bigger impact? Why didn't they influence other regions? Why didn't they spread? The answer is probably geography. The Amazon is isolated, surrounded by mountains on one side, ocean on the other, inhospitable savannas on the third. And inside it, rivers. Thousands of rivers that serve as roads, yes, but also as barriers, because each river basin develops its own ecology, its own culture. So maybe these civilizations never had the opportunity to expand. Like the Incas or Aztecs, they remained confined, restricted. Or maybe they didn't want to expand. Maybe they were comfortable where they were. They had food, they had water, they had their cities, their traditions, their lives, and that was enough. Until it wasn't anymore, because eventually something went wrong. Drought, disease, environmental collapse, civil war, I don't know. Something broke the system. And when the system broke, there was no going back. The population dispersed, the cities were abandoned, and the knowledge went with them. And that's what scares me, because knowledge isn't eternal. Knowledge needs to be passed on, taught, practiced. And when the chain breaks, when the generation that knows dies without teaching the next, the knowledge disappears forever. And that's what happened here. Centuries of accumulated knowledge, of agricultural techniques, of hydraulic engineering, of forest management, all lost, or almost all, because some current indigenous communities still practice versions of these techniques, still create Terra, Preta, still manage the forest the way their ancestors did. And when scientists finally stopped to listen, they discovered the knowledge hadn't completely disappeared. It had just been ignored. And maybe the biggest lesson here isn't about the past, it's about the present, about what we're losing now, about what we're ignoring, because while we're here rediscovering lost cities from 2,000 years ago, the Amazon continues to be deforested, burned, destroyed, and along with it go the last vestiges of these civilizations, the last archaeological sites, the last indigenous communities that still carry fragments of this ancient knowledge. We're losing again, and this time it might be definitive. So what remains in the end? What do we take from all of this? Because look, this story isn't just about archaeology. It's not just about lost cities and ancient technology. It's about how we see the Amazon, how we see indigenous peoples, how we see human history itself. For centuries, the narrative was simple, elegant, comfortable. The Amazon was a virgin forest, untouched. The peoples who lived there were primitive, simple. They lived in harmony with nature because they didn't have the capacity to modify it. And that narrative served certain interests very well, because if the forest is virgin, if nobody was ever there doing anything significant, then there's no history to preserve. No legacy to respect. You can deforest, you can exploit, you can treat it as empty territory, but it wasn't empty. Never was. There were millions of people there, building cities, modifying landscapes, creating fertile soil, domesticating plants, managing entire forests as productive gardens. And when we ignore that, when we erase this history, we commit a double injustice. First, against the past, against the people who lived, worked, built all of that, and deserve to be remembered. Second, against the present, against current indigenous communities who are descendants of these city builders and are treated as if they had no history, as if they appeared out of nowhere. This makes me uneasy, makes me uncomfortable, because we like to think we're more advanced, more sophisticated, that our technology is superior, and in some ways it is. Of course it is. But in others we've lost valuable knowledge. Terra Preta still works better than chemical fertilizers in many contexts. Elevated fields still produce more than conventional agriculture in floodable areas. The forest management that created those urban gardens is still more sustainable than monoculture. So maybe we should stop looking backwards with condescension and start looking with curiosity, with willingness to learn. Because these civilizations solved problems we still face today. How to feed large populations in difficult environments, how to manage limited resources sustainably, how to create systems that work. For centuries, without collapsing. They didn't get everything right. Obviously, eventually their systems failed. The cities were abandoned, but they lasted a long time. Much longer than most of our modern cities have existed. And that's worth something, worth study, worth respect. But here comes the part that worries me most. The window is closing. Archaeological sites are being destroyed. Deforestation, mining, industrial agriculture. Every year that passes, we lose more evidence, more context, more possibility of understanding. And the indigenous communities that still carry fragments of this ancient knowledge, they're under pressure. Losing territory, losing languages, losing traditions. In 1 or 2 generations, much of this could have disappeared completely. And then we'll have lost twice. Lost in the past when European diseases decimated the populations. And lost in the present when we didn't protect what remained. This doesn't have to happen. It's not inevitable. But it requires choice. Requires action, requires that we value what's there. And part of that is telling these stories, is bringing these discoveries to light, is making people know that the Amazon has history, deep history, complex history, history that deserves to be known. So tell me something. Before hearing this, did you know there were lost cities in the Amazon? Did you know there were pyramids? That there was sophisticated agriculture and advanced hydraulic engineering? Tell me in the comments. I want to know if this story was new to you or if you'd already come across it before. And if it was new, why do you think nobody told you? Why isn't this in school textbooks? Why do we grow up thinking advanced civilization only existed in Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, Mexico? Does this bother you as much as it bothers me? Leave your opinion down below. Let's debate this, because look, I could end here with a beautiful conclusion, with an elegant synthesis, but that's not how history works. History is messy, it's incomplete, it's full of unanswered questions, and the history of ancient Amazon, it's only beginning to be told. We discovered the cities, mapped some structures, understood some techniques, but there's much more. Much more waiting. Each new LiDAR flyover reveals something new, each excavation brings more questions, and every year that passes we realize we underestimated the size of populations, the complexity of societies, the scale of environmental modifications. The Amazon wasn't a green desert, it was a mosaic of cultivated landscapes, a continental garden, a masterpiece of ecological engineering that took millennia to be created, and we almost forgot it existed. Almost, but now we know, and knowing, we can't pretend ignorance anymore. Can't treat the forest as empty anymore. Can't act as if there wasn't history buried beneath every tree. There is history. There are cities. There are millions of lives lived, millions of stories told around fires that went out centuries ago. And some of those stories are still echoing, still waiting for someone to listen. Do you think we'll listen? Or will we let the noise of the present drown out the whisper of the past? That's the question. And the answer depends on what we do now, in the coming years, in the coming decades, because the forest still holds secrets, but it won't hold them forever, not if we keep destroying before understanding. And it would be a tragedy to lose all of this again, to lose it, definitively this time. So if this story moved you, if it made you think, share it, spread it, make more people know, because knowledge only has power when it's shared. And these stories, These stories need to be told. Leave in the comments which detail impacted you most. The Earth pyramids, the Terra Preta that still works after 2,000 years, the geometric cities hidden beneath the jungle, or the fact that we almost lost all of this forever. I read all the comments, all of them, and I like knowing what you're thinking, what intrigues you, what bothers you, and if you want more stories like this, forgotten stories, lost civilizations, knowledge that almost disappeared. Subscribe, because there's much more out there, much more waiting to be discovered, much more waiting to be told. History didn't end. It was just sleeping, hidden beneath the trees, waiting for someone to point a laser from the sky and say, "Wait, there's something here." And there always was. We just needed to know where to look.